I'm Laura Chandler from the Foundation of the Sacred Stream and Sacred Stream Radio podcast, and I'm speaking with Thupten Jinpa for the Wisdom in Exile Conference. Jinpa, thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you, Laura, for inviting me, and I'm honored to be part of the series.
Well, you have a long list of accomplishments so far in this lifetime. You've been a monk and received the highest degree of study, the Geshe Laram degree. You've also received a Ph.D. in religious studies from Cambridge University. You're the principal English translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You've written several books of your own, including A Fearless Heart, How the Courage to be Compassionate Can Transform Our Lives. You established the Institute of Tibetan Classics to translate and preserve the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. You've been the chairman of the Mind and Life Institute and helped create CCARE, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research at Stanford University. And all this just scratches the surface. And I mention this because I think that your work puts you in the unique position of understanding this question that we are considering today about the preservation of Tibetan Buddhism and what the future of Buddhism looks like for both traditional societies and contemporary ones. So I'd like to start by asking you, what distinguishes Tibetan Buddhism from other forms of Buddhism?
That's a very, very interesting question, actually. One of the ways in which the Tibetans, we ourselves see our tradition to be is actually the Tibetans see the Tibetan tradition to be sort of continuation of the Indian tradition. Mm-hmm. So one of the great kind of, a source of pride for the Tibetans' own self-image is that we are the custodians of the great wisdom of the Nalanda, Indian Nalanda tradition. So, and the Buddhism came to Tibet in the 6th, 7th century. And then since then, the contacts have been directly with the great monasteries of India, like Nalanda, Vikramashila, and so on, Jakartala. And many of the great Indian masters have come to Tibet, and also many scholars have collaborated with Tibetan scholars and translators. Many Tibetan translators spent time in India, Nepal, and at various other institutions, and systematically translated many, many texts. So, one way in which we can see Tibetan tradition to be distinct from, say, the Japanese Zen tradition or the Theravada tradition that we see in Sri Lanka, and Thailand, and Burma, or the Chinese Mahayana tradition, is that the Tibetan tradition can be seen as historically the existing surviving tradition that has somehow managed to keep the entirety of the Indian Buddhist tradition. Mm. So that's one way of looking at it. Then, of course, there are further, developments within Tibet itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Would it be fair to call it Indo-Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes, in fact, that's the jargon that the scholars use. Of course, outside the scholarly world, people think, what is Indo-Tibetan? But the idea is to really capture the idea that, of course, there's a lot of innovations, particularly in the domain of practice in Tibet. For example, you have the Mahamudra, Dzogchen, and so on. Mm-hmm. But historically, the main foundational works that all the Tibetan traditions study, practice, and meditate upon, they tend to be from the Indian tradition and in great Indian classics. So, these days, sometimes people refer to Tibetan tradition as Vajrayana, mm-hmm. and the Pali tradition as Theravada, and the Chinese tradition as Mahayana, and Japanese as Zen, which is a sort of it's not inaccurate, but it's, in the case of Tibetan tradition, it's kind of little incomplete. Vajrayana definitely is an important aspect of the Tibetan tradition, but what we find in the Chinese Mahayana tradition, they are all also contained in the Tibetan tradition. And many of the teachings and practices that you find in the Pali tradition, like the monastic traditions, study of Abhidharma, Satipatthana, the mindfulness practice, all of these are also found in the Tibetan tradition. So that's why, Tibetan tradition sees itself as a kind of a complete sort of a form of a form of Buddhism that existed up until the 13th century in India. 12th, mm-hmm. 13th century. Yeah.
That's great. And do you feel that there are certain Tibetan Buddhist practices or perspectives that can be helpful to the West in particular? And what are those?
I think one of the things that we find in Tibetan tradition that I think will be very useful to the West is because of being a custodian of the Nalanda tradition, Tibetan tradition has really developed this line of deep thinking where, what is the relationship between reason and spiritual experience? And how can we have a comprehensive, integrated view about the nature of reality that does not reduce everything to matter, which is what science tend to do. So having a rigorous, generally what happens in the West is that the West likes to compartmentalize, okay? So you have the mystical experience, you have belief in God, we say, this is a private domain, this is religion. Then you have, something to do with human psychology and experience and insight. They say this is psychology. Then you have the bigger questions about what is the meaning of life, what is the role of reason, and all of this. They say this is philosophy. So West likes to compartmentalize. And then the dominant view when it comes to having a more comprehensive worldview, then it tends to be grounded in science. Mm-hmm. So now in that kind of scientific worldview, it's very difficult to accommodate a robust place for a meaningful understanding of human experience and potential for spiritual awakening. And that's one of the reasons why in the West, historically, there has been a huge conflict between faith and reason. And the relationship between faith and reason has not been worked out. And generally, a religious person, deeply religious person would say faith is a gift. You either have it or you don't have it. So it's almost like a kind of a gift from God. Mm-hmm. And then the non-religious person will say faith depends upon blind faith and you don't have any basis for believing in something. And that for a rational person, it's unbecoming of subscribing to a faith. So there is a kind of a dichotomy created. So what we see in the Tibetan tradition is that because of this ongoing Nalanda tradition and development of that line of thinking, that takes reason very seriously, but at the same time, situates reason in the service of understanding the deeper meaning of human existence, condition, as well as having a reality. So what we find in the Tibetan worldview is an integration of a worldview that has a combination of reason as well as intuition and as well as a sense of spiritual meaning. And that has been quite systematically worked out. I mean, at the end of the day, someone may not find what the Tibetans are proposing to be compelling, but at least the attempt has been made, successive generations, throughout centuries, to really always strive for a much more integrated understanding of our human existence, so that our worldview is not reduced to everything is just matter or everything is just spirit. So that, I think, is something that the West can really learn. And then the other thing is that in the modern kind of thinking, we struggle for understanding the concept of ethics. Now, in secular society, we tend to, again, relegate morality to a private sphere, and we feel somehow the moment you bring morality and ethics into the public square, you're worried that someone else is going to impose their views upon you. So there is a kind of almost like a kind of a visceral aversion to subscribing to any more universally binding values. So that's a problem. So therefore, we don't have, the contemporary society in the West doesn't have a robust language for accommodating ethics into a public space and a public discourse. Again, here, the Buddhism, because its approach is not dogmatic, it basically emphasizes principle over prescription, which is where the Western approach in the past has gone wrong. In the past, the Western approach to morality was all about rules. And the quest has been to find those, perfect rules that the God has somehow laid out and if you just obey them. So it was obsessed with rules and prescriptions, whereas the Buddhist approach has been, working towards what are the underlying principles. And the underlying principle is really compassion. So then to be ethical is to find out what is the most compassionate thing to do in a particular situation. So there's less dogmatic approach, but there is a greater emphasis on understanding the importance of compassion as the foundation. And that way, if we develop that kind of discourse on ethics, which is what His Holiness is proposing when he talks about secular ethics, then we have a chance to develop a discourse which is more universal, even on ethics. And here, at the end of the day, unless we are prepared to say that, individuals, human beings living in different cultures, so different that there is nothing in common. If we are not willing to go that extreme, then we have to say that, okay, it doesn't matter what background you happen to have, what language you are speaking, what religion you subscribe to, so long as you are a human being, you are subject to human condition. Suffering is universal. Our desire for aspiration to be happy is universal. Everybody, regardless of what family background they come from, want their loved ones to be happy. Nobody wants to have problems. These are fundamental human reality. And it's a universally shared reality. And if we acknowledge the universality of those fundamental human conditions and aspirations, then clearly, as His Holiness points out, we have a basis to build a robust ethics with shared fundamental human values that are not dogmatic, but that proposes a guideline for living. And this is, again, one area where the Tibetan tradition can really offer, I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to turn into Buddhist, but what we can learn from the Tibetan tradition is, again, how to develop a robust discourse on ethics that is not dogmatic and that calls upon the individual's intention, motivation, and seeks some kind of synchrony between the aspirations and their action. Because if we are able to bring people to their best level of aspirations, everybody will say they wish well for the world. They wish well for their neighbors. And unless you're fighting, then it's different. But, as a default, we all have good aspirations, but we fall short in our everyday life because we haven't somehow made that connection, how to translate that aspiration into everyday reality. And this is one area where, particularly like the compassion training that are developed, such as the one that I developed at Stanford, the secular forms, which are more universal, these can help individuals find a way in which they can really bring ethics and ethical values an important part of the guiding principles in their life, not in the dogmatic form, but in the form of an overarching philosophy of life, and which, in the end, individuals who choose to live according to those values are themselves going to be happy. His Holiness often points out that when you act compassionately, the first beneficiary is yourself, because you have been able to experience something that is beyond yourself. You have been able to expand your sense of self and reach down and make connections with others. Whether that act actually benefits the recipient, the object of your compassion, depends on many other factors. But you yourself has already experienced that joy, that elevation, that moral elevation. So I think those things, the Tibetan tradition is very rich in these kind of ideas, and the practices and tools that go with them in self-cultivation and the relationship building cultivation. Those are another important thing that the Tibetan tradition really offer to the contemporary world.
I'm looking forward to you writing that book, Jinpa. I hope you'll write a book about this. You mentioned the compassion protocol, and I want to talk about that. And I also want to talk about your work with Mind and Life Institute. Yes. We were talking about, this relationship to faith and reason and science, and Mind and Life is addressing so much of this, kind of bridging the cultures here.
Yeah,
what more can you tell us about that? And
I think Mind and Life, as an organization, I mean, as a conference, it began with a series of conferences called Mind and Life Dialogues. And originally, it was set up as a platform which will bring scientists who are working the frontiers of science to have a chance to sit down with His Holiness. And it was primarily to serve His Holiness. Initially, that was the idea, so that he doesn't have to go out and meet everybody. So we're bringing, it's a bit like if, what was the saying, if the Muhammad cannot go to the mountain needs to be brought to Muhammad. I think it's that kind of idea. But then over time, it became very clear that this was more than just His Holiness's own personal engagement with the important discipline of modern knowledge. So, and one of the things that Mind and Life has really done successfully is really to, expand the boundaries and horizons of scientific discourse. Because science is very methodical, and most scientists are essentially, technicians. They are confined to a very narrow field of their study. They're driven by the research proposal. They need to publish. They need to find something or not find something, and it's very technically oriented, very practically oriented. And that's in fact the strength of science. That science builds up a body of knowledge. Someone finds something, adds onto the bucket. Another one finds something, adds onto the bucket, and then eventually the bucket fills up. And then non-scientists will, who are interested will say, "Oh, so and such findings have been published." But on the other hand, science always has this larger role, which is the role of offering an explanation of our reality. Some scientists will dispute that, but science, whether scientists themselves like it or not, increasingly play that role of giving the big picture. So the relationship between mind and matter, that's a major frontier. Can the science explain consciousness? This is, some refer to it as the final frontier of science. Science has gone very deep into the matter, the smallest constituents, and got to the point where you don't find anything, but still there are quantum effects. Science has gone really, really deep, almost to the point of becoming mystical. When you listen to some of the ideas that are coming out of quantum physics, they're almost mystical descriptions of reality. They are going beyond the binary of existence and non-existence and all of this. So science has this larger role, but one of the problems have been when it comes to non-matter issues like consciousness, human experience. Up until recently, science has found it very difficult. First of all, there isn't any language that they can use, and science always needs something to measure. They need to have some kind of measurement, because if you can't measure, it's not real for science, And if you can't compute, it's not real.
Yeah.
So even although in the very, very quantum level theoretical physics, they can't measure something physically, but at least they have maths to compute something, all this mathematical calculation. When it comes to consciousness, they have nothing. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems for science.